Wow, everyone just told me it was time to get started. Okay, so I'd like to reconvene the board meeting. And to start, we would like to acknowledge the traditional territories and oral practices of the Blackfoot Nations, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai. We also acknowledge the Tsuut'ina and Stoney Nakoda First Nations, the Métis Nation Region 3, and all people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of southern Alberta. I would now like to take this opportunity to welcome all of our staff and public in attendance at this meeting. Representing our stakeholder groups, we have Kevin Kemp from the ATA Local 38, Lois Robb from Calgary Board of Education Staff Association, and our principals, we have Derek Rakowski from Belvedere Parkway, Matt Christensen from Robert Thirsk, and Jana McDonald from Bonus. So we'd also like to welcome the grade 1 students from James Short Memorial School and their teacher, Ms. Waters. Students have moved their classroom to the historical Dr. Carl Safran building. Their week has them investigating the question, how are we connected to a healthy community? They will be exploring what it means to be connected to a classroom, a neighborhood, and a city, and how they can make a difference. They will also be meeting community helpers and discovering what their roles are in shaping our schools and everyday lives. They met with Acting Deputy Chief Jeannie Everett today and will meet with Trustee Hare on Thursday. So if you could all stand up, give a little wave. We're happy to have you here. So our first item of business is to approve the agenda for today's meeting. Ms. Minor, do you have any changes that need to be noted?
Madam Chair, the one agenda request that has been received is that item 8.1, locally developed courses, be removed from the consent agenda. This report will be brought forward at a future board meeting.
So could I have a motion that the agenda be approved as amended? Trustee Herdlicka, all those in favor? That is unanimous. The first item on our agenda is awards and recognitions. Today we are recognizing and honoring Legacy Award recipients Andrew Hall and Jeremy Bryant. The Cbe Legacy Award celebrates public education in Calgary and the individuals who have contributed to our communities. In every corner of the city, across the country and beyond, our alumni have made a lasting impact. Public education makes a difference in our communities, our country, and our world. Legacy Award recipients embody the work of the public education system and represent the legacy of the CBE, preparing students for life, work, and inspiring lifelong learning. It is my great honor to present the Legacy Award today to two graduates of the CBE, Andrew Hall and Jeremy Bryant. Jeremy and Andrew are cousins who also happen to be co-founders of MealShare. MealShare is working to end youth hunger by making it simple for individuals and businesses to share meals with youth in need. Here's how it works. MealShare partners with restaurants in various cities by placing its logo next to a few menu items. When customers order a MealShare branded item, the restaurant contributes $1 to MealShare. Most of those funds are forwarded to a partner charity to go out and purchase the groceries and ingredients needed for one meal. So when you buy a meal, you give a meal. It's that simple. In Calgary, MealShare partners with the Calgary Drop-In and Rehab Center and Brown Bag-In for Calgary's Kids. Internationally, they partner with Save the Children. Since 2013, MealShare has provided over 1.9 million meals to people in need in cities across Canada and recently in the US. You might be wondering how these two young men ended up on this charitable path. Andrew and Jeremy grew up in Calgary and spent their youth as students, athletes, travelers, and volunteers. They attended the University of Victoria and University of Alberta, respectively, where they both earned Bachelor of Commerce degrees with specializations in entrepreneurship and accounting. And they went to work for the Big Four accounting firms. But less than a year into their dream jobs, they recognized something important. They wanted their careers to be in their control and to be engaged in employment where they could make a positive difference in their community. Since launching in 2013 with just 2 restaurants, they now employ a team of 14 and have partnered with over 325 restaurants. But these two are dreaming even bigger. By 2022, they want to expand MealShare to 25 cities and to provide over 4 million meals to youth each and every year. Their work has not gone unnoticed. They are winners of the 2016 Canadian Social Venture of the Year Award by Air Miles and the 2015 Community Impact Awards from the Calgary Chamber of Commerce and Small Business. Jeremy and Andrew were also recognized as two of Canada's top 30 under 30 sustainability leaders by Corporate Knights magazine in 2015. Andrew and Jeremy have a rich family history in the CBE. Andrew's mom, Carol, has been in the system since 1981 as a teacher, assistant principal, and principal. She currently works in talent management as a principal consultant. Andrew and Jeremy's grandfather, Alan Deschamps, was an associate superintendent with the CBE from 1963 to 1981, and they are both with us today. Between them, Jeremy and Andrew have attended 6 CBE schools. Andrew graduated from the CBE in 2007 after attending Dr. E.W. Coffin School, Senator Patrick Burns School, and William Aberhart High School. Jeremy also graduated in 2007 after attending Nellie McClung School, John Ware School, and Henry Wisewood High School. These young men embody many of the results we want to see in our CBE students. They are passionate, community-minded individuals who demonstrate the difference that can be made by graduates of the public education system. Sometimes we think that it's too difficult for any one person to make a difference. Whenever we feel that way, we should challenge ourselves to think about Andrew and Jeremy and the 2 million meals they have provided to hungry youth in this country. Thank you, Jeremy and Andrew. Unfortunately, Jeremy was unable to join us today, and so I'd like to invite Andrew to say a few words on behalf of Jeremy and himself, and then please remain at the podium for a photograph.
Testing. Sweet. Awesome. Thank you so much for the story and all the kind words. That was amazing. Hoping to just say a few words of thanks myself and tell you a quick story. So first of all, just wanted to thank Jeremy, who, like you said, couldn't be here, but he's been an amazing co-founder and partner and cousin and best friend for my entire life. So thanks to him. He said he would have loved to have been here, but he's, I think, riding camels in Morocco today on vacation. So hopefully he's having a good time. Thanks, secondly, to all my family. So as mentioned, to my nan and pop, and my mom, Carol, and dad, James, for providing me every opportunity growing up that I could have ever asked for. And of course, my brother, David, who is undoubtedly Mealshare's biggest fan and biggest supporter. So thanks, guys. And then finally, just want to say thanks to everybody here for the recognition. It means a lot to us, and to everyone within the CBE who made our educations possible growing up. So story time. They say you only get one chance to make a first impression, and the CBE definitely did just that for me with a very memorable first impression, and truly a very first impression because it was on my first day of grade 1. So I know the students out in the crowd will be able to understand this story. So it was about 25 years ago, so some of the details are a little bit hazy, but I do remember wearing my Winnie the Pooh shorts. That was important, you don't forget that. And then the day at school is a little fuzzy, but then I definitely remember what happened after school. So I walked out across the schoolyard to the 2 big yellow buses and jumped on my bus among all the older grade 5s and grade 6s and sat down and started watching as we took off to take me home. Drove through Brentwood, dropped off a bunch of kids, and the numbers were dwindling, and all of a sudden I was the last kid on the bus and I hadn't seen my stop. So somehow I ended up on the wrong school bus. There's a 50% chance I managed to fail my first test of school. And I think it sounds like a sad story, but actually it's a happy story because the bus driver then worked with me to find directions to my house, drove me, chauffeured me all the way home directly to my front door. And the days before cell phones, that was basically the only option we had. And luckily, Mom was waiting there for me. So I think that shows kind of a cool thing in the way that the rest of my education ended up. And that is that even though there was some struggles here or there was someone there to support me, get me where I needed to go, if you see what I did there, and made sure I learned something, and not too many tears were shed along the way. So it was great. So it was right around that time, age 5 or 6, that I remember sitting at one of the many family dinners at Nan and Pop's house, and Jeremy and I would always push our vegetables around and leave our green veggies for last. And inevitably, every time, our Nan would come over and tell us the same story and say, there are starving kids in Africa who would love to have that food. You should appreciate having your vegetables. At the time, you don't really understand why you should appreciate having your vegetables. But obviously that made a mark on us, because after we graduated from the CBE and then from our university degrees, and got our dream jobs working for the man, as we call it, in accounting and consulting, it didn't take us long to do the only safe, logical thing you can do, and that's immediately quit and start a nonprofit company. So yeah, obviously we heard the details on where we're at with MealShare, and it's been an amazing ride over the past 5 years, and we have big goals for the next 5 years. And our vision is someday to be sitting in our rocking chairs, teaching all the grandkids around about youth hunger. But we want to teach them a different story about how youth hunger used to be a problem, but isn't anymore. And we want that to blow their minds. And hopefully we can teach them to get on the right school bus as well. So thanks again so much on behalf of Jeremy and I really appreciate it.
So I'd now like to present you with our Legacy Awards. So just so you know, the artwork was done by students at Nellie McClung School. And I have one for you and one for Jeremy. That was a wonderful start to the board meeting. Thanks to everyone who came down for that. So the next item on our agenda is our results focused. Today our agenda is the annual monitoring of results 5, character. Chief Superintendent Stevenson, would you please introduce the report?
Thank you very much, Chair Herdman and trustees. I think we've just seen an incredible example of character from CBE graduates. This report today provides evidence from the 2016-17 school year of each student in the CBE working to develop the attributes and standards of behavior that contribute to positive and healthy relationships, personal fulfillment, and the common good. In 2016-17, at least 97% of students experience success on each of the 2 report card measures of making responsible decisions and treats others with respect and compassion. Of the 7 student survey measures in this report, 5 have results that exceed 90%, and all 7 are the highest or second highest recorded levels, demonstrating both success and improvement. We have learned that one of the most difficult things we ask students to do within the character result is to respectfully challenge policies or decisions with which they may disagree. We continue to encourage and seek growth for our students in this area. The success of our students with results 5 is confirmed in the examples and individual measures of success experienced by our students to possess the strength of character to do what is right, act morally with wisdom, and balance individual concerns with the rights and needs of others. Chair Herdman and trustees, please join me in welcoming Alexander from John D. Diefenbaker High School, who will speak to how he and his peers have experienced success in character as part of their CBE learning programs.
Good afternoon, Chair Herdman, Board of Trustees, Superintendent's team, and other honored guests. My school experience has helped me develop my character because it has taught me of how to think of the concerns of the group over my personal ambitions. I've had the opportunity to learn from others and determine the kind of person I want to be through ways such as teamwork in the classroom, TA activities, assemblies with motivational speakers, or through fun activities for all students. The Spirit Days, for example, have helped me build on my sense of community and helped our school build on their sense of community. And it has helped me form relationships that are important to build character. Additionally, during our TA time and interactions with teachers, I find that their examples of morals and compassion has not only helped me improve my character, but also helped me to make decisions about doing what is right. More specifically, when I first started high school, I noticed an opportunity for me to help more students have a voice in our school. I went to my leadership teacher and principal to talk and brainstorm some ways I could contribute. Thus, we made a plan that every month we would have a lunch hour where we could meet with students in a high-traffic area and have a conversation with them. We did manage to conduct in-depth conversations and discussions over what the students wanted and what they thought about the school. Due to all this work and effort put into the project, we were able to determine some key points that we could change within the school. As a result of this, the school community has grown closer to each other due to improved communication. By acting based on the needs of others and bringing up something that I thought was important, I was able to make a real change in the school community. I've learned through my school experiences the values needed to make informed decisions in alignment with my values and character. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Chair Herdman and trustees, before we move to your questions, please allow me to point out 2 editing errors in the Results 5 monitoring report. The footnotes on page 411 and 417 do not match the report card measures they are attributed to. The information in the footnotes is for Results 4, personal development. The correct report card indicators can be provided at your convenience. And with that clarification, we now welcome any questions or comments you might have on monitoring report for Results 5, character.
Thank you, Chief Superintendent. That actually answers my questions. Trustees have received and reviewed the Chief Superintendent's report regarding the annual monitoring of Results 5 character, and it's now the board's responsibility to consider the report as evidence of reasonable organizational progress in this results area. So do trustees have any questions on the report? Trustee Bradshaw is making weird faces at me, so I'm assuming that's a question.
Well, more comments, I guess. So at the start of the year, well, our term, I guess, I had a teacher come up to me and say, these are really hard to mark and give grades for, because it's, it's so subjective and it's hard to, takes a lot of work. And I'll tell you another story. So when I was coming home I was picking my son up from school one day, and we were walking home, and I asked him how his day was. And he's like, well, Dad, it wasn't so good. We were really misbehaving in class today. And I was like, well, what happened? And he's like, well, we were just being bad, and our teacher took away all our points. And I asked him what he was doing, and he's like, yeah, I was misbehaving too. I was really glad he was telling on himself, because otherwise we wouldn't know. But I guess the point is that I think it's really important we monitor this stuff. It is hard to mark. It's a lot of work, but when I go to talk to my son about how he's doing at school, more often than not, it's about character issues instead of how he's doing with his marks. I mean, we get the report cards, and that's really important. And if there's problems there, we can deal with them. But I think this is the stuff that's going to kind of get them through life. So I really appreciate that we do this one.
Thank you, Trustee Bradshaw. Any further questions? Trustee Hare.
Along the same line as Trustee Bradshaw, not so much a question, but a bit of a comment. And my comment stems from the statement on page 23 where a student states, fortunately, when students do make mistakes or morally dubious decisions, they face fair consequences far less severe, yet hopefully almost as impactful than those that would occur in the real world. And my comment simply deals with, I appreciate what the student has said, but having spent a great deal of my time in school and in different roles, I always felt that school was the real world. And the real world for the students and the teachers who were involved in it. And sometimes I thought that real world was actually a better, fair, and more honest place. And so my comment would simply be that when people leave school, and I had the tremendous honor of being at the Forest Lawn graduation yesterday, and these people are moving into a different world where clearly there are consequences that may be different than are felt in school, but certainly no less impactful. And certainly I would hope that the character that our students develop while in the real world of school assists them in the real world which is outside of school. So I'm very pleased to see this report. Thank you.
Trustee Hurlica, do you have a question? Okay.
I do. My question is 4-2, and it's in the summary. And I recall there was a similar comments when we did personal development around chi-squared comparison. And I just need a clearer understanding if I could get some more information around when we talk, the comment here is chi-squared comparisons of the report card data are not possible due to the varying percentage of students for whom identified special needs influence the overall results. Could you, Chief, could you share some information around that so I have a better understanding?
Chair Herdman through to Trustee Hrdlicka. So the students who are on an IPP are assessed against the measures that are in their IPP. The other measures that students are assessed against are the ones that are the STEMs. They can be assessed on all of the STEMs. And so when we try to pull all of those together and make a prediction using a chi-square, we're trying to mix two ways of assessing together, and we can't. So what we did on this report as a result of the feedback we got on R4 is I removed the IPP data and did a chi-square on the remaining data that can be compared. And the measure is indicated there for each of the report card, each of the two report card indicators.
Trustee Hurlica?
So just to be clear, the other measures that those students on IPP, they're also measured through that, that's included with the chi-square, so you've taken out the IPP piece and you've just looked at those other measures? Sorry.
Chair Herdman, through to Trustee Herdlicka. Sorry, I wasn't as clear as I intended. So students who are assessed according to their IPP indicators that relate to character are not included in the chi-square calculation.
So Chair Herdman, to Trustee Herdlicka, the short answer to that second question is yes.
Trustee Adams.
Thank you. I'm sure it says somewhere in here, but I just couldn't find it. What is the rate of return for these student surveys? Like how many students actually fill them out?
Chair Herdman, to Trustee Adams. The number of students varies each year because the number of students varies each year. So we tend to have more than 3,000 responses at the grade 12 level, and it actually increases with the younger students. So because the staff spend more time with them to help them fill in the survey, so it varies grade to grade, but I think the smallest we have is about 3,000.
Sorry, so what percentage then? Sorry, I should have been more clear.
So in grade 12, I don't have the total enrollment numbers in my head, but we could assume there'd be more than 10,000 students.
Trustee Dennis.
So I don't have a question, I guess just a couple of comments, similar to Trustees Bradshaw in here. I also really appreciate that we actually encourage strong character in our students. I think that we can gain recognition because of our intellect, but we gain respect because of our character. And if we don't maintain good character, if we don't have that respect, then our voices end up being lost, no matter how smart the things are we say. So I really appreciated the comment from one of our students on 424, and where students talking about a challenging situation where they needed to be honest about something, and it takes courage to be honest about something when it actually isn't what everyone else is thinking. And so I appreciated those comments, and also thought what a great job our teachers are doing when our educators create an environment in the classroom where students can feel free to voice their opinion, and not only that, when they're taught to do it respectfully. So I appreciate also that we monitor this and that we promote good character in our schools.
Trustees, any further questions on this report? Okay, so any trustee who wishes to bring forward a motion regarding exceptions or commendation should provide the motions to the corporate secretaries and to all the trustees by the end of the day tomorrow, Wednesday, May 16th. And this item will be placed on the May 22nd agenda for board consideration. Next on our agenda is operational expectations, and today we're monitoring OE12 facilities. So Chief Superintendent Stevenson, would you please introduce the report?
Chair Herdman and trustees, we are pleased to present this monitoring report to you today. Operational Expectations 12 Facilities. The expectations identified in this policy highlight the crucial role facilities play in supporting student learning. I'm happy to welcome Superintendent Breton to present this monitoring report and to highlight further details for you.
Board of Trustees, good afternoon. I'd like to highlight a few aspects of this report, starting with Indicator 12.1B1. It speaks to the evidence provided by condition assessments conducted by Alberta Infrastructure. School assessments were not conducted by Alberta Infrastructure in the 2014-15 school year, when the government transitioned from the old facility assessment system named RECAP to the new system now called VFA. As a result, the CBE has been out of compliance ever since 2014-15 and might remain out of compliance for this indicator until the 2019-2020 school year when the 5-year cycle is completed. The conduct of Alberta infrastructure school assessments is unfortunately out of CBE's control. Note, however, that the CBVFA results on the 80% of schools that have been inspected within the 5-year time frame indicate that all schools except for one have achieved a fair or better score. The only school to attain a poor indicator was Bowness High School. However, the assessment was conducted prior to the modernization completed in September of 2016. As a result, I would anticipate that when this school gets evaluated again, the result would be very different. Indicator 12.1E1 establishes the objective of having 100% of provincially funded capital projects and undertaken by the CBE delivered on time and on budget. Now, 2016-17 saw the CBE open 18 new and replacement schools, complete 2 modernizations. So truly an exceptional year that will be remembered for decades to come. Certainly speaks also to the tremendous dedication of the CBE staff and all of our partners involved in making these school openings possible. It should be noted, however, that the original opening dates for these many new schools was established by the government without a project schedule or any prior consultation with school jurisdictions. So of the 4 2017-18 new schools being constructed during the 2016-17 school year, the year of this report, the CBE and its partners successfully completed Manmeet Singh Buhler on time. That one opened actually as a modified calendar school in the month of August, as well as Marshall Spring School that opened at the start of the school year in September. However, in the end, overly aggressive opening dates coupled with unforeseen construction challenges resulted in the late opening of 2 schools, namely Ron Southern and Griffith Woods School. Accordingly, the CBE is non-compliant with this indicator, as those 2 schools would have had to have been completed by the end of August 2017 in order for us to be able to open them for the start of that school year. Additionally, indicator 12.1D3, and this is for the 4th consecutive year, I'm pleased to report that the total value of maintenance projects that incorporated energy efficient and sustainable products rose by over 20% to an all-time high of $31.6 million. To put this in perspective, these investments figured at a modest $3.9 million in 2012-2013. With the introduction of the carbon levy on January 1st, 2017, the CBE's investment in energy efficient building systems are certainly money well spent. And then finally, the last indicator I'd like to bring to your attention is 12.2.4, that evaluates the CBE's adherence to the Level 2 Ordinary Tidiness Standard of caretaking and cleanliness. Now note that this cleaning standard was created by the Association for Higher Education Facilities in 1992. And it forms part of ANSI, or the American National Standard Institute, so that group of standards. It's used by school jurisdictions across North America. And although CBE schools are maintained at the Level 2 Ordinary Cleanliness Standard overall, I think it's important to underscore how CBE custodial staff throughout the system take great pride in adhering, whenever possible, to the Level 1 Orderly Spotlessness Standard for washrooms specifically. This to provide students and staff with the clean and hygienic environments that allow them to focus on learning. In the 2016-17 reporting period being covered, we had some 26 new custodial staff added to our ranks, bringing the total number of CBE custodial staff to a record number. So overall, I believe that the progress and attention to facilities, as evidenced by data presented in this monitoring report, supports student learning, and certainly be pleased to respond to any questions you may have at this time.
Trustees, any questions? Trustee Dennis has a question. She's just finding it.
All right. So I have a question about, so on 5-12, at the top of the page, it talks about the school naturalization or garden development requests. So I was curious about so when a community decides, you know, a parent group advocates for a naturalization project, or a administration of school advocates for that, and they're sort of championing the cause to have a naturalization project done, is part of that process, when they apply to do that, to gain approval for that, is part of that sort of the legacy piece around it? Because sometimes when the parent group leaves, or that administration then leaves the school, the naturalization project becomes extremely natural because it's not tended anymore. So I was just curious if in that process, if there's some conversations that happen around what happens in 5 years when we're all gone.
Chair Herdman to Trustee Dennis, certainly that is a very important part of the discussion that happens with any group that wants to bring forward these sorts of initiatives. We do want to support those initiatives, even if it does only last for 5 years. And then if after that time, if there is a certain laissez-faire or abandonment of the naturalization to nature, then at that point in time, we do have to start looking at what we are going to do next with those. But again, I think what we're trying to underscore here is there's a responsibility. These families do move on during those years. They do benefit from that opportunity. And after that, again, it's a question of looking at what can be done.
Trustee Hrdlicka?
So just a follow-up to that same indicator. I'm wondering what has been the result of completing these requests and the subsequent creation of the naturalization sites in the school gardens on student learning? So I'm wondering, because we are an organization that it's about student learning. And so some people might think that people can come and say, I want to plant a garden and I'm going to do it on a school, and that's it. But what is the connection to learning for our students, and why is it important, I guess, around this indicator to get those approvals done within that period of time?
Chair Herdman to Trustee Hrdlicka. I think the primary motivation that most people have for the naturalization is to improve the learning experience of students, to get them connected to the outdoors, to sometimes get them away from screens for a little bit and back into that other kind of childhood learning experience. We would have no data that would directly connect that experience to an impact on results. As you see there, it's a very small group size, so 5 in this year, and each school may have had somewhat different learning intentions for their students connected to that.
Chair Herdman to Trustee Hrdlicka, just to clarify, there certainly are outcomes within the program of studies related to our natural environment and the care of it, the world that we live in. So there are outcomes that students are working towards, that these environments enhance their learning opportunities.
Trustee Adams?
Thank you. I'm just on page, sorry, let me scroll down. 5-14, and I'm looking at number 5 that says 100% of emergency maintenance and repair work requests responded to within 24 hours, and then the last paragraph says it's 6,492 out of 6,492 emergency maintenance and repair works requests were responded to. And that just seems like a large number to me. So I'm just curious, is that kind of a normal number for a school year? And what actually is, like, what is part of an emergency maintenance repair work? Like, what does that entail?
Chair Herdman to Trustee Adams. In terms of the numbers, I coincidentally happen to have past 6 years of data in front of me, and it varies typically within that zone between, I see here, 5,700 to about 6,500 emergency work requests. So we're sort of staying steady, despite the fact that certainly the total number of schools has increased dramatically over this past 2016-17 school year. Maybe I'd also like to just point out that when I talk about, or when it references here that work requests are responded to within 24 hours, what we're trying to do there is ensure that any sort of health and or safety situation is controlled and doesn't necessarily mean that the repair is completed within that time frame. What sort of event could be happening? It could be something like a heater, a heating system not functioning properly and temperatures being too cold in the classroom. It could be a burst water line due to freezing weather, like we had this month of January. So again, the intent here is that within 24 hours, the water lines are turned off, loss has stopped within the building in the sense that there's no more water pouring and damaging further. And then very rapidly, we're looking at cleaning up and repairing so that students can reintegrate their learning environment.
So on the same page, right under when it talks about the regular maintenance and repair work requests, so how many of those do we get approximately per year?
Chair Herdman, so we receive about 22,000 work requests a year.
Trustee Hrdlicka?
I guess we could look at the same page there. And my question is, we're going to be looking at the budget here shortly, and we know that there has been, we're going to see less staff in facilities or positions. How is that going to impact the ability of the system to be able to respond to some of these requests, and for our chief to be able to bring forward operational expectations that are following suit with what we request from him, that he's actually living up to what we've asked of him when we have these cuts in education happening and it's impacting staff.
Chair Herdman to Trustee Hrdlicka. I'll start off and then I would turn it back over to Superintendent Breton. I think that in past budget years, we have identified quite honestly that when we have situations where we are cutting back on services or spreading services thinner than we would like, then it puts the chief superintendent as well as the system in possible jeopardy. To this date, we've avoided any major issues, but we certainly have brought forth operational expectations where in some cases we have been non-compliant in particular areas. I would give exactly the same caution as we go forward with the current budget. We are not able to provide everything to everybody that we would like, and that puts operational expectations in jeopardy. We always prioritize safety and security first, and so the kind of things that Superintendent Breton has mentioned around things that would put any student or staff in jeopardy are attended to as the highest possible priority.
Chair Herdman to Trustee Hrdlicka. So the approach that Facilities and Environmental Services took in reviewing the changes required for the 2018-19 budget avoided, by and large, any impact on custodial staff or maintenance personnel. So the focus was truly on the management levels, and so that is where an additional burden is being placed in terms of managing the multiple events that could be occurring at a single time. If, for example, we have more than one school that has a pipe being that's burst, but from an actual capacity to deliver, that has not changed. Again, the little caveat in that is that if we are reducing or downsizing a building, so for example, in the case of vacating Viscount Bennett, well then obviously the staff that would have been assigned to that building would no longer, those positions will be impacted, but the individuals, given the large number of custodial staff, we believe will be able to, through attrition, reintegrate other positions elsewhere throughout the system. So again, we've been able to maintain the number of custodial and trade staff to the same levels.
Throughout the document, we refer to the 3-year infrastructure maintenance and renewal, or IMR plan. I was wondering how we create that plan when we don't have certainty around what our IMR funding will be from year to year, and whether or not that plan is posted anywhere, given the uncertainty and funding for that.
Chair Herdman. So yes, the 3-year infrastructure and maintenance and renewal plan is something of a challenge to plan in the sense of the lack of clarity as to what the government will be providing year over year. That has varied over the last 5 years from $12 million in a year to almost $40 million. Typically the approach is that based on wherever we are at in terms of the value for that school year that has been provided to us, we assume very cautiously that something similar is going to be occurring the subsequent year, and that helps provide some form of planning. Certainly when you go from 12 to 40 million, that is a big change, and the capacity to deliver on that then can become a problem if those figures are increasing dramatically year over year. The plan itself is developed based on our very intimate knowledge of our schools, based on the fact that, again, all of our staff work out of our facilities and report the issues that they're seeing. We have our own inspections that we conduct of our facilities, and then, of course, the third-party VFA inspections that are conducted by Alberta Infrastructure of our facilities. And so with that knowledge of the buildings, of the systems that they're composed of and their typical life cycle, we know when certain systems need to be replaced. Then we also know where we're getting actual situations where systems are actually getting close to failing because we're starting to see symptoms leading to potential failure. That information is used to develop the 3-year infrastructure maintenance and renewal plan. The plan isn't published publicly because of that great possibility of variation. Not only is there the variations in terms of funding levels that the government provides us, but it's also in terms of what occurs during the year. And so if there's an emergent issue that arises, and suddenly when we go to patch a roof, we discover that we don't just need to patch the roof, we have to replace the entire roof, and maybe there's some additional work that has to be done to the mechanical systems on that roof, then all of a sudden other projects will end up having to be moved to subsequent years. The other thing too is that this list is essentially a list of projects identifying the school and a very short title. And depending on everyone's interpretation of a certain word and that very short title, we don't want to unnecessarily alarm anyone that their school is in any way, shape, or form unsafe, because certainly those issues we would be attending to already. So for those different reasons, we don't necessarily make that public. It is available, obviously, to you if you should wish to have that, and if you should wish to make that public. I believe that there's probably, and working with my counterpart, Superintendent Brad Grundy, we've been talking about potentially a variation thereof that would just underscore how much we're planning on expending on different building systems. So again, roofing systems, how much we're planning on expending on mechanical systems, and so on and so forth, that gives that picture of where we're investing the money, the IMR dollars, and that then can give a little bit more visibility to how we're using these funds.
Chair Herdman, to trustees, I wouldn't want to oversimplify, but what I would add to Superintendent Breton's comments is that school boards throughout Alberta are faced with the need to have extremely agile, solid leadership and staffing in many, many different areas. There are changes that we face on a regular basis. In fact, change is the only constant, whether that's around educational outcomes, whether that's around curriculum, whether that's around facilities, unprecedented new school development, no school development. It absolutely requires a quality staff who can adapt and quickly adjust to what the demands are.
So I appreciate getting this report to have a fuller picture of all the complexities involved in the facilities department. On page 5-11, we talk about replacing fixtures with energy efficient products. And so I know that we have to pay the carbon levy for certain things, but are we eligible for certain rebates from the carbon levy in order to offset the cost of some of those purchases?
Chair Herdman, unfortunately, the answer is no.
I'll add it to the list. Okay. Trustee Hrdlicka?
So at the CBE, environmental leadership and energy management along with waste reduction, that is something that we value. We have it in our OE here. We also have it in citizenship. But we also have the sustainability framework at the CBE that has targets. And we also have a sustainability strategy. Historically, have we as trustees been updated on, like in a public meeting, on the targets that are set, like the energy efficiency targets that are set in the sustainability framework? And the reason why I'm asking is because the CBE is a leader in sustainability in the country when you talk about school boards. And we are doing some amazing things to address environmental challenges that are going to be coming at our students, but also within our buildings. The fact that when we look at here at the indicators and what we're doing around being more energy efficient and working to save money, but also to reduce our waste in so many ways. So that's why I'm asking this particular document around those targets, if it has been brought to trustees previously, or if it's looking, we might consider that in the future.
Chair Herdman to Trustee Hrdlicka. To my knowledge, so going back to October 2015, there has not been a public presentation of the sustainability framework and our progress on the targets that are assigned therein to the Board of Trustees. Certainly, if that's something that you're interested in, that's something that can be provided. I would just put a little additional comment, though, on this, is that we were doing great until 16-17 saw the opening of those many schools. And so certainly we would be in a hurt locker, I would say, if we hadn't have done the progress we had with all of the energy efficiency work that had been invested in that. But so if you take out that last year, and our targets are all based on the 16-17, or most of them are based on 16-17 for electricity and natural gas, and that's when, boom, you get the spike occurring from turning on all those new schools.
So I guess I'll throw that out there to trustees to maybe consider having a presentation on the sustainability framework, because it would give us a better idea of, I think, the challenges we're facing, but also the great work that is actually happening within the system that we don't necessarily see every day, but also the impact of that on our student learning.
Trustees, any further questions? I just have one last one on page 5-9. We talk about standard preventative maintenance routines. and I know as homeowners, we're probably all guilty of not following our industry standard preventative maintenance routines. So I'm not surprised that, I was actually surprised that we do 80% of them. That's pretty good. But can you identify, how do we determine which ones are of sufficient low risk that we do not feel the need to do them according to the recommended schedule?
Chair Herdman, certainly again, what we're looking at is to ensure that we are maintaining compliance in terms of any laws or city bylaws. We're looking at ensuring that the CB isn't exposed unnecessarily to any higher degree of risk, and something that wouldn't necessarily have an immediate impact. And so a good example of that is direct fire heating systems. Recently, all of those systems within the CBE reached the end of their life cycle, and so a program was put in place to replace all of those heating systems. And so now, given the fact that they are brand new, we can afford not to do the inspections that the manufacturer would necessarily recommend. That will catch up to us at some point in time. But at this time, this is an example of something that we wouldn't do. So the other thing that we could consider as well is something like on a mechanical system with any, for example, belts that drive a fan or whatever else. So instead of inspecting and replacing the belt prior to its failure, well, you're waiting until you get a call saying we're not getting any air in this classroom, and then we're replacing the belt. The impact is minimal. And we're able to manage the more important inspections, such as, for example, the playground inspections that take top priority, to ensure that those are inspected in accordance with the manufacturer's and CSA requirements.
Trustees, any further questions? Okay, if any trustee wishes to bring forward a motion regarding exception or commendation, they should provide that to corporate secretary and all trustees by the end of day tomorrow, Wednesday, May 16th. And if there are no exceptions or commendations, this item will be placed on the consent agenda for the May 22nd, 2018 board meeting with the motion that the Board of Trustees approves that the Chief Superintendent is in compliance with the provisions of OE 12 facilities. So today we have one request for public comment from Ms. Lois Robb. So I know that you know all the rules, but I'll just read through them quickly because I'm supposed to. I would ask you to focus on matters before the board today and refrain from speaking on the personal character or performance of any individual's department or school in accordance with our board meeting procedures. So could you please state your name and any organization that you represent?
Thank you. Lois Robb, Cbe Staff Association, and I'm the chairperson. So I'd like to speak around budget. I read through the entire document. That was a bit of a challenge on a number of pages. And what I realized from that document, and also from conversations with hundreds of members, Staff Association members, there's a reality that we really need to look at. At the end of the day, it comes down to you don't know what you've got till it's gone. We lose significant expertise and significant pieces that help make the system work for students. Each employee is part of the whole. That whole ultimately makes the system work for students. When you lose too many spokes in that wheel, it can't function. It loses its structural integrity. And then it becomes a rough ride. And we've certainly experienced that more and more over the past 9 years. It's a challenge for the superintendent's team, everyone involved, when you're sitting there having to make decisions around what should be priorities and how to put students first, because it really takes all of it and everyone in the system to make it work. Employees do a great job of filling in the gaps, but there's another cost to that. And we see that in increased workloads. We see that resulting in mental health and wellness issues. And so we end up with more challenges to deal with. And so at the end of the day, we need to look at that whole picture and really think about that when we're looking at this document and speaking to it and advocating for more funding for public education. I could stand here all day to talk about specific impacts to staff association, but it's not just about us. It's about everybody in this room. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Robb. So then the next item on our agenda is item 7.1, Students Come First Budget Report for the 2018-22 school years. Chief Superintendent Stevenson, would you please introduce the report?
Chair Herdman and trustees, the CBE's proposed 2018-19 budget is the result of significant consultation and work over many weeks and months. I would like to thank all those individuals and groups who have provided us with their perspectives and feedback through the budget development process. The input has been invaluable to our work. I also acknowledge the provincial government for continuing to support public education through challenging economic times. We appreciate the funding we have received for enrollment growth and maintaining of funding rates. I believe this budget does the very best to meet each student's unique learning needs within the resources that have been provided. While we are not able to provide all that we would want to support students through this budget, I believe it represents a careful balance between need and available resources. Difficult choices have been made, but we will continue to meet the needs of our complex system. Keeping dollars flowing to schools has been our top priority this year. You will see $1.1 billion spent on instruction, supporting the achievement of success for each student. This includes 8,769 full-time equivalent positions. The resources allocated directly to schools will increase by approximately $22.5 million in 2018-19. Additionally, the Minister of Education has indicated that classroom improvement funding will be continued for the 2018-19 year. Taken together, that increased funding will go some ways towards meeting our system's ever-growing needs. While the situation in our schools is reasonably stable, I feel it merits mention that for the last two budget cycles, we have leaned heavily upon our service units to help close the funding gap. This year's service unit cuts range from 3 to 10%. Our service units allow our school-based staff to focus on teaching and learning, and without the diligent work performed by service units, the administrative burden that would fall to schools would be crippling. This budget will see some staff, primarily in service units, exiting the organization. To those staff, I offer my sincere thanks and appreciation for their commitment to students and to public education. With reduced staffing, the CBE will continue to rely upon the dedication, professionalism, and creativity of our remaining staff to do ever more work with fewer resources. These are some of the difficult choices required in order to continue to meet student learning needs. We look forward to the positives this budget provides, including $3.5 million allocated to having a designated and supported math leader in each school. We also see the implementation of our replacement student information system, providing greater access to and use of student profile data for students, families, teachers, and leaders, while supporting the best practices in assessment and grading and creating administrative efficiencies. We continue our focus on engaging with our community and look forward to acting on the results of last year's employee engagement survey while preparing for a follow-up survey next spring. I firmly believe that we have achieved a reasonable balance. I have great confidence that the CBE will continue to provide a top-quality public education that will ensure CBE students are well-equipped and ready to be productive, active, and engaged citizens. There is so much good in the Calgary Board of Education and incredible schools, successful students, amazing staff, and incredible programs and services. I believe every Calgarian should take immense pride in their school system. We are happy to take any questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Superintendent. We'll take a break in about 20 minutes, so if I cut you off after some questions, don't worry, we'll be coming back for as long as you need to. So we'll start with questions, trustees. Trustee Hrdlicka.
I guess the first question would be, how is the reinstatement of the SIF grant going to impact this budget in front of us?
So Chair Herdman to Trustee Hrdlicka, I'll begin and then ask other trustees to add if they so desire. So my understanding at this time, we were notified late last week that we will receive just a little bit more funding than we did last year for classroom improvement. We've also received direction that this money is to be prioritized for staff and for that staff to be directly related to classroom support for our English language learners and our complex learners. We have already deployed those funds out to our schools through the RAM, and we've done that in consultation with the same committee that existed last year, although I would note that this year it is not part of the ATA collective agreement as I understand it. So when you ask what will be the impact, it will allow us to continue to maintain a significant number of staff that otherwise would have been moved or exited the organization. It will allow those staff to continue to work with our existing staff to provide the best possible educational opportunities. So $13 million could translate into roughly 130 FTE of teaching staff. The direction this year is that it would go towards teaching and/or support staff. And so that is the direction we've given our principals. The additional dollars allow us a small contingency that we will put out into areas so that if there are exceptional circumstances, we can add additional resources to those particular situations. So it is a very positive impact for our students and for the I was going to say burden, but maybe that's not the right word, for the workload on our staff. There is nothing that is of greater benefit to our students' learning than the staff that we have in our classrooms. I don't know if there's any additional comments.
Superintendent Grundy, did you have any
Chair Herdman and Trustee Hrdlicka, I guess I would just simply add that, yeah, so in terms of the document and the tables, we should expect to see Alberta education revenue flowing into the CBE increase by $13,281,000. We also anticipate that certificated salaries and benefits together will increase by about $10.6 million, and non-certificated salaries and benefits, all school-based, will increase by about $2.6 million. We also anticipate that certificated school-based staff will increase by 106 FTEs, and non-certificated school-based FTEs will increase by approximately 43, for an overall FTE increase of 149. I should note that that's based on experience that we had in the current year, projecting that forward. Obviously, our principals may make slightly different decisions, but broadly speaking, those are the impacts that we should see. The instruction block total will obviously increase proportionately, so there will be a small uptick in that. Those would be the major number impacts as a result of the continuation of the Classroom Improvement Fund.
Yes, I know as I was reading the budget, I always had to add throughout the entire document. But yes, we only got those numbers, I believe, last Friday afternoon, so. Trustee Davis?
So I know in our budget assumptions report, we were looking at a 0.5% decrease in RAM funding rates. So with the SIF funding, does that essentially bring us up to even?
Chair Herdman, through to Trustee Davis, it's an interesting question you ask because it depends how you treat the SIF this year. So essentially, we still have a gap between what we ideally would have rolled out through our resource allocation method to schools to maintain status quo. What I would say is the application or the announcement around the Classroom Improvement Fund gets the current year total increase in the RAM close to where we would need it to be if it was a non-SIF year compared to a non-SIF year. But we are actually in a year where we had SIF in 2017-18. We're essentially using the SIF for this year to cover off the gap in just the regular RAM funding, if that makes sense. So said another way, maybe this is a better way to look at it, the SIF funding is basically flow through. We get it in and we flow it out. That's the same as last year. So that's basically even. We're still left with the dilemma that the amount that we put out through our resource allocation method wasn't the exact amount we would need to maintain staffing levels equal to 17-18. So there's still that small reduction. Having said that, we will see staffing levels go up by about 149 over what we were proposing for 18-19. So that's a positive.
So just to follow up on that, what do we anticipate our total increase in FTE to be?
Sort of total FTE increase related to like overall?
The overall budget.
You have to give me a moment to dive.
That's okay. That's the sort of question I should submit in advance so it's ready. That's my fault.
Chair Herdman, 80 up.
Thank you. Trustees, questions? Trustee Davis.
We just want to talk a little bit about transportation. And the report indicates that we will be asking for a 4.5% increase in transportation fees. And so can you articulate what's happening both with service levels and with costs that is requiring us to increase those fees?
Chair Herdman to Trustee Davis. So let me start by underscoring the fact that the fee increase obviously is limited to a small percentage of the overall numbers of students accessing transportation, because of the fact that Bill 1 makes for that service to be free for all of those that meet the eligibility criteria that were described as part of legislation introduced last year. So when that legislation was introduced last year, one component that had not been factored into the budget was the actual management of the Calgary Transit Rebate Program. So in order to be able to provide the rebate to those students who are entitled the Calgary Transit Rebate, there was a need to actually enter into a contract, and I believe that's somewhere in the order of about $600,000 to actually be able to deliver that service. In addition to that, the Calgary Board of Education, as part of its contract with its service providers, pays the actual cost of fuel on the first day of the month, of that month. Basically, it's a shifting target day to day, in fact, maybe even from morning to the afternoon. And so the agreement with the service providers, once a month, that's the rate. And as you can see, as of recently, certainly the price has been going up. So there's another component of the cost that we're having to absorb. I guess another component that we have to keep in mind is that of the non-fee paying students, the fee replacement grant for those students that is provided by the ministry, our indications are at this time, and certainly that was the case for the current school year, 2017-18, the fee replacement grant was based upon the number of registered riders in the 2015-16 school year, and based on the fee rate of the 2015-16 school year, so $300. And so the fee replacement grant that is provided is already in a slightly negative or shortfall situation in comparison to what this year's transportation fees are, $335. And as part of this budget, the delta is growing even larger as we're proposing that to be increased to $350. And of course, the other part is, I think that thanks to the great services our schools provide, and also just the attractiveness of the city, we are seeing growing complexity in the system. And so this year, we saw a larger number of requirement for complex learning need attendance on the buses than what had been planned for. And we are continuing to see that evolution. So those factors altogether ultimately create a situation where the fee increase, which will actually, I guess as part of Bill 1, as I was indicating previously, will only impact those students who are not eligible. That fee increase will bring in approximately $200,000 extra. I do see a lot of additional costs coming our way that will more than exceed the amount of the increase. However, the fee increase being proposed stays within the parameters of what's allowed for, and that is under 5% or less.
Trustee Davis.
So in terms of that monthly invoice, I guess, that we get from our busing companies on the cost of fuel, are they required as part of that reporting to indicate what the current rate they're using? And are there components of that fuel cost that have gone up since January 1st that would be included in that, and are those broken out?
Chair Herdman to Trustee Davis. So again, the cost or the rate for the fuel is selected based on the first day of every month that the service is provided. And there's an agreement that's come to between ourselves and the service providers as part of the contract in terms of what rate is going to be used, in terms of not just your corner fuel outlet. So that will fluctuate again. The components that make up the cost of the fuel are not required under the contract that we have to be broken out. What we are provided, however, is the total number of liters of the varying types of fuels that are consumed. And so knowing, for example, that yes, as of January 1st, the carbon levy was increased from $20 per ton of CO2 equivalent to $30 per ton of CO2 equivalent. That essentially meant that the tax on the diesel, in this example, went from approximately 5 cents a liter to 8 cents a liter. And so those are components within the cost of the fuel that certainly end up impacting the bottom line. I think I've covered all the questions you had.
Trustee Adams.
We've talked a lot this year about noon supervision fees, so I have a few questions about that. 7-64 is the page that I'm on, and I see that we're going up $10. And my question is do 100% of the fees that are collected stay at the school level? And if not, what is the percentage that actually, like if my child goes to school and I pay so much, does all that money stay at my child's school, or does it actually get rerouted, and how does that work?
Chair Herdman through to Trustee Adams. The noon supervision program is a centrally administered program, which means that we accumulate all the costs across the system for the provision of noon supervision. And then as we receive no funding from the province for the provision of that program, the fee is calculated based on a full cost recovery model. So specifically, the fees that are collected via a school are not necessarily returned to that school for the provision of noon supervision. A simple example would be there are certain costs that are incurred centrally that don't occur at those schools. The fee revenue has to cover all of those off. So there's an example of why that wouldn't be the case. I hope that answers the question.
It does. I'm just curious, do we know what percentage goes back to the school, or does it not calculate that way?
Trustee Herdman through to, Chair Herdman through to Trustee Adams. I guess the short answer would be no, I don't have that calculation in front of me. If I am looking at 7-64, however, I would note that there are about $558,000 in central administration. The lion's share of the cost is school-based staffing. So I would suggest that the lion's share of the fee revenue that's collected gets redeployed back out to schools. It just may not be equivalent to where the fee revenue is generated in the schools, depending on staffing levels, configuration of the school, decisions that are made in the local community.
Trustee Davis.
So when we look at page 7-14 and the first bullet in that last paragraph, it talks about the designated and supported math leader in each school of 3.5 million, which roughly I think is about 14,000 per school. So can we just have an explanation as to how that program's going to be administered?
Chair Herdman to Trustee Davis. So we have identified 59 schools using the same process and data set that we used in the fall to choose the first group of schools for math coaches. And we have, through the RAM, given them sufficient funds to be able to have a half-time math coach in their schools. And that's been the primary cost that we've been able to send to the schools. The funding, there are additional costs because we, on top of those 59 schools, all of the other 180 schools will also have a math leader designated. We will be supporting both the coaches and the designated math leaders out of the learning service unit, and do not have additional funding to do that, so those costs are absorbed. And some of the learning experiences that will be provided to the leaders in the schools require some substitute costs, and that will be absorbed through other school budgets.
So are the math leaders in addition to the designated learning leaders?
Chair Herdman to Trustee Davis. So yes, so if you have a math learning coach, then that's your math leader, a designated math leader. But if you didn't receive a math coach, then there's still someone on staff that you have identified to do some math leadership at your school, connected to the larger network in the organization.
So so if you had a school that had 2 learning leaders, does this mean there's funding for a third? Or is the request that one of those 2 be a math learning leader for the ones that aren't funded for coaches?
Chair Herdman to Trustee Davis. The person does not need an administrative designation as a learning leader. Many of our small schools aren't able to provide that, so they would designate a math teacher, a math lead teacher, rather than an administrative position. So no requirement for a learning leader designation.
And so the learning leaders typically have additional funding, though, correct? If you're a designated learning leader, there's an additional payment made to those staff. So for the math learning leader, is that the case or no?
Chair Herdman to Trustee Davis. So if a staff member is a designated learning leader, yes, there is a small administrative allowance that goes with that position. To be the designated math lead in your school, you do not need to be a learning leader. You can be a lead teacher. So some schools, the ones that are big enough to have learning leaders, will be using the learning leader designation, but small schools will still have someone who may not be a learning leader.
And so just in terms of this, so if a teacher takes on the math leadership role, are they provided with a reduced workload to accommodate for that, or is this something extra that they're taking on?
Chair Herdman to Trustee Davis. I think that would be a context-dependent circumstance. So we certainly have defined limits in terms of assignable time for our teaching staff. So it would need to fit in that assignable time, and I don't know school by school what the trade-off to accommodate that would be.
Any questions on the math leaders before we take a break? Is it on math? Okay. Trustee Hrdlicka?
So I guess my question would be, what led us to make the decision to have a math leading person, however we want to define that, in every school? I know we're taking on math strategy, and we had an update of the strategy and where we'd focused our energies, and what we found, what was working and what wasn't working. But I'm wondering why we're designating $3.5 million to have those leaders in our schools, in every school.
Chair Herdman to Trustee Hrdlicka. So the $3.5 million is specifically for the math coaches, and certainly our early feedback and the early information that we're gathering is that that is becoming very successful, and schools were very hesitant to give that up once they had begun on that path, and there certainly was interest in expanding that. So the cost has gone to that piece, but I think for this to be the mass strategy to be as effective as it can be, we want to be able to support as many schools as possible. So this year we had approximately 50 schools who were supported in intense ways through the kind of professional learning cohorts that were attached to their school development plan. So the efforts that have gone into that level of support will then shift over to the designated math lead in each school. I think this is something throughout the organization that people very much want to understand, want to think about their practices, want to better understand the program of studies and its implications. So we are responding to the needs the best that we can.
Okay, I think we will take, if I say 15 minutes, will you actually be back in your seats in 15, or should I say 10? We are meeting back here at 10 to 2. I would like to call us back to order. So we are still on item 7.1, which is the budget. Trustees, are there any further questions on the budget document? Trustee Davis?
So we're still on page 7-14, that same paragraph, but the next bullet down talks about our student information system and providing specifically around supports best practices in assessment and grading. Can you talk about how the system supports best practices in assessments?
Chair Herdman to Trustee Davis. Just to clarify, you're speaking specifically how the SIS supports those practices? Yep. Okay. So within the student information system, within Power School, there is a grade book that teachers can use to collect their assessment information across time, and then use it to lead their judgment toward the awarding of a final course mark at report card times. So one of the things that high schools have been particularly working toward is being able to make a transition from the determination of grades that are based specifically on assignments to more of an emphasis on the outcomes of the programs of studies that those assignments represent, so that there's mapping that's really clear behind the assignments and those grading systems. So we have been able to work with the gradebook within Power School that will lead teachers toward those practices. There's conversations that are happening right now among some of our teaching staff around how to work with different programs of studies within that, so that that can be communicated both through the report card and on a more regular basis to students and parents, and they can see the learning assessment tied to specific outcomes in the program of studies.
There's a lot of information on page 7-14. So on the same page, we talked about the new program of studies that the province has said at least will be piloting or starting in 2019-20 for K-4. Has the province given any indication that they will be providing any funding in order to prepare teachers for this new program of studies?
Chair Herdman, we haven't had information, yay or nay, around any funding to support the implementation plan. We do know that there is work beginning in the next little while to look at a provincial implementation plan. So perhaps once that's determined, that information would be clearer.
And just to follow up, when the program of studies has changed in the past, has there been any funding attached to it?
Chair Herdman, in the recent past, no. In the long-term past, yes.
So just staying on the same page. The staff engagement survey, it says in the report that we will be administering it again next spring. I'm just wondering how much that survey will cost. Is it just the $100,000 that's written there?
Chair Herdman, yes, that's correct, $100,000. Keep in mind, employee engagement survey first time, there was a number of other supports and services that we drew upon from Aon, the service provider. Now that we've been through it once, we anticipate that those direct service provider costs will be reduced. However, there will still be costs across the system to receive the results, understand the results, engage with staff, and then implement change.
Trustee Davis?
So on 7-15, under plan operations and maintenance, I know it indicates here we're spending just under $170 million. As I recall, last year we spent more money than we received for that funding block from the province. Is that anticipated to be the same this year?
Chair Herdman through to Trustee Davis. Yes, that's correct.
My follow-up question is 10 million. Is that the number?
Chair Herdman through to Trustee Davis. Yes, it's approximately $10 million more than what we get allocated for plant operations and maintenance.
Okay, thanks.
So a subject that's come up in the media a lot has been the Ed Center this year and how we allocate the lease costs. So I know that you provided a nice table that shows how we allocated it last year and how we're going to allocate it going forward. And so it shows that we will be allocating a small portion of it to, I forget what it's called, external services or something like that. Have we cleared that with Alberta Education?
Chair Herdman, so an interesting question. As you're probably no doubt aware, the operational review report seemed to suggest that all costs associated with the Education Center lease and related operating costs should be charged to board and system administration, which you can see on 7-17 is the second column. Subsequent conversation with Alberta Ed staff was around what's called the external services block. The challenge there is the Alberta Education definition of external services suggests that you cannot use Alberta Education funding for the provision of external services. So in our world, a great example would be noon supervision. We receive no funding from the province for the provision of noon supervision. Under their guidance, noon supervision can be considered an external service. However, there are certain individuals who provide service, as we discussed, located centrally. If we truly want the noon supervision program to fully cover its costs, we would need to allocate a portion of the cost of this building to that program. I've had those conversations with Alberta Education. I have had verbal assurances that they're comfortable with the approach we've taken. I have not received formal written confirmation of that approach. We'll see how that plays out over time, but I certainly have verbal confirmation that it is appropriate to charge the full cost of programs, including overhead for buildings in the external block. Another great example for us is the sublease of the top 2 floors of this building. We do that to offset some of the cost of the lease. There should be an allocation of some of the cost of the building to those 2 floors. That was a specific example I had with, a discussion I had with Alberta Education, and they are supportive of the approach that we're taking. So I'm fairly confident that the allocation that we have represented on 7-17 will meet their with their approval.
Trustee Davis?
So when we look at our per teacher allocation through RAM, I believe last year it was 102,000. And I'm just curious, with the amount of new schools that we've opened and new hires, have we seen a change in that cost as new teachers come on? And the second part of the question would be, what work do we do forecasting forward based upon the makeup of our staff?
Chair Herdman through to Trustee Davis. So yes, there was a slight decrease in the average teacher salary, which is what we use to allocate dollars out to schools. So when we reduced the allocation amount, or sorry, what would we say? When we increased the RAM allocations overall, but by a smaller than necessary amount, we were also benefiting from the fact that the average teacher salary came down somewhat. So said another way, the purchasing power of the school budgets went up. We do annually look at the progression of employees through the grid. We also do some estimates around how many people we believe will be exiting the organization, both through seniority, if you will, they're ready to retire. There are some people who exit for other reasons, and then we have some ideas around how many then we need to bring into the system at the lower end. So that work is always ongoing. As we go through the year, we look at our actual spending patterns against what the budget anticipated, and if there's variances, we then look at, is that because we're seeing some changes in the average cost, or are we seeing some difference in what we call the volume, speaking like accountants? So we have rate variances and volume variances. We look at those to see what's driving the change. I would also note that we're budgeting right now for a school year that doesn't start until September, and we can, when the school year clicks over around January, get new information from various benefits providers, pension plans, those kinds of things where they're changing their contribution rates. Recent example is we were advised that the local authority's pension plan was going to reduce what the contribution rates were both for employers and employees. That comes in the midst of the actual year. So those are hard to forecast. We do as best we can, but sometimes we just get external information that changes things. But yes, we do monitor that, and we believe that because of that slight reduction in the average cost, schools should be able to plus or minus maintain where they were for the prior year, subject to that SIF conversation we had previously.
Trustee Hrdlicka?
So on page 7-3, it's kind of in the middle of the page. I guess it's the 1, 2, 3, 4th. The fourth bullet, when we're talking about service units, and it says approximately 69 full-time employees have been reduced in service units, including areas and school-based custodial services. Do we know how many staff that is? Actual staff?
Chair Herdman through to Trustee Hrdlicka. So the short answer is no. The reason why is we've estimated the number of full-time equivalents, so the amount of effort that has been reduced out of the budget. You'll be aware that about 98% of our staff are covered under some form of collective agreement. There are a number of procedures that we need to work through as we make those staffing adjustments. Plus, as we were just speaking about, there are people who are naturally leaving the organization either through retirement or they're moving, life events for them. So in terms of actual people, no, we don't know that at this point in time. And I wouldn't expect we'll know that with certainty until probably sometime around October. Once we've done our fall budget update, we know exactly how many bums are in seats in schools, and those final school-based staffing decisions have been made. Having said that, there have been some non-unionized staff who have or will be in the process of exiting the organization. We would have better information on those sooner, but as the process is certainly evolving currently, I wouldn't want to sort of get ahead of that. Chair Herdman through to Trustee Hrdlicka. One other thing, so keep in mind that that 69 FTE estimate was pre-SIF. Now most of the SIF will be in schools, almost all of it, but we don't know what the knock-on implications are. As there are more opportunities in schools, some of those people, FTEs that were impacted, might find suitable employment out in school land. So we'll have to see how that all works out, like I said, in October.
Trustee Hrdlicka?
Just to follow up to that, so we know that there were a number of staff that weren't in schools, so those positions too. Is there opportunity for those staff, some of those non-certified, to come back into the schools with the SIF funding?
So Chair Herdman, what I would say is depending on the skill set of the individual, there may be opportunities. There's a concept of families in the collective agreement. So if your skill set is equivalent to other members of the broader family, there is that ability to move into those types of roles. If you're, however, like picking on a custodian just as an example, that may not be a great place to launch into an educational assistant role, but there may be some other classifications where there is some of that ability.
Given that trustees need to approve a budget, and the SIF funding just came in last Friday, the budget that we send to Alberta Education, which is on page 7-187, is just that little 12-page document in their format. Is it possible that we can include the SIF funding and have updated numbers before we submit that to the province?
Chair Herdman, yes, we are working to have those Alberta education documents updated for both the SIF and the impact of the recent board motion related to all-day kindergarten. So the documents that will go to Alberta Education will be updated. The challenge that we had was just that the number of places where we've either referenced revenue or expense and charts and graphs and language was innumerable, so we weren't able to make those adjustments for today's meeting and likely won't get that updated for the 22nd either. But the Alberta Education documents will be accurate when sent.
So before the next board meeting, when we vote on this, we will have the correct numbers on that 12-page document for Alberta Education.
Chair Herdman, that's the plan.
Trustee Davis?
So on page 7-70, that top table there, and when I was looking at this, I was reminding of that very technical term we used in audit committee, which being slice and dice, which breaks down our spending. And I just if you could clarify for me again what that regular basic staff allocation refers to within a school.
Chair Herdman to Trustee Davis. Introduce. I'm Donna Rogers, Manager Corporate Planning and Reporting. The regular basic staff allocation represents the per school allocations that each school will get based on the type and size of school. So each school gets a principal, allocation for assistant principal, admin secretary, that kind of thing.
And just on the same graph, that contract absences, I know I had some questions around this in the bar report, and so that relates to sub-days within the RAM budget, 4 days and under, is that correct?
Chair Herdman through to Trustee Davis, yes, schools through this allocation fund the first 4 days, and then there's a central allocation that would handle any absences beyond 5 days, beyond 4 days.
So no, an item of common concern in the public is class sizes. And so we have that chart on somewhere, if I can find my question, that says that we anticipate, page 7-34, where it shows the number of school-based FTE to student ratio. And we show that going up to 14.2 from 14.0 this year. So now with the addition of the SIF funding, do we anticipate that we can stay closer to the 14.0?
Chair Herdman, so we have not done the recalculation yet related to the SIF, but I think your logical assumption is correct. Whether it will hit 14, don't know. It'll probably get closer to 14 and further away from 14.2.
Chair Herdman, if I might add, that class size, as you referenced, is only impacted by teachers. The addition of support staff wouldn't impact the class size number.
No, I don't think any member of the public thinks we have class sizes of 14. That's school staff to student ratios. Trustees, any further questions? Trustee Davis?
On page 7-76, when we look at the utility budget, we see that we go from a budget for next year of 187 versus 173. And it's my understanding that for this budget, we're including the addition of 2 new schools that'll be opening, but it's roughly a 10%, almost a 10% increase in utilities. So can we just talk a little bit about what's happening with those rates or why that's going up?
Chair Herdman to Trustee Davis. I'll just bring to your attention the fact that utilities on page 7-76, you'll see that line repeat through the different service units as well. So it's not representative of the entire utilities component for the Calgary Board of Education. In regards to the increases that we're seeing, the other thing that we need to keep in mind is that the schools that have opened haven't necessarily operated, some of them, for a full year. And so we're now in the process of we're truly seeing the reflection of the 22 schools that were opened in the 16-17 school year and 17-18 school year in the 18-19 budget. And so that's where you're starting to see that starting to play out within the 18-19 budget.
While we're on the subject of facilities, with Alberta Infrastructure now leading our large capital projects, what is the CBE's role in these capital projects? Are we still, I know before we had community involvement and we had these committees, but now that Alberta Infrastructure is doing it, what is our role?
Chair Herdman, the role of the Calgary Board of Education continues to be one of informing the construction of a building so that it actually becomes a school. And so the Calgary Board of Education has design guidelines that have been informed by best practices, by our interpretation of what is best for students and their learning environments. We've captured that within our design guidelines that include such things, for example, as gender-neutral washrooms that reflect our own interpretation of Bill 10. The career and technology spaces and how they should be built out and what levels of or types of equipment that are within those areas. So the Calgary Board of Education then, in working with Alberta Infrastructure, has to be taking the decisions because, as is always the case, the budget doesn't necessarily fit what our desires are. And so Alberta Infrastructure will come back to the Calgary Board of Education and say, so do you prefer cinder block walls, more expensive but more resilient, or do we go with a gyprock wall and save some money there so that you can do a little bit more in this space or over in that space? Those are the sorts of decisions that will be brought back to us. As far as the consultation process, it has not changed in the sense that it's the same as what was used in the past, and we have a good reflection of that in terms of the 3 elementary schools that were announced back in March of 2017, and then earlier this year, in February of 2018, once the drawings had gotten to the 40% stage, we had information sessions that were held out in the communities. This now in conjunction with Alberta Infrastructure, as opposed to completely in isolation or completely contained within, if you want. And so sessions that are held within the community in order to provide an opportunity for individuals to provide input. And then certainly as part of the City of Calgary's own development permit process, once the school is submitted, if you want, to the city for consideration, they review that and they have their own processes to ensure engagement. So for example, community associations are part of the development permit approval process. So before a school before any ground is broken, there are multiple avenues and possibilities for input from the community.
Trustee Hrdlicka?
So on page 776, and it's one of the bullet points, the first bullet point at the bottom of the page It talks about certificated positions have been reduced in environmental initiatives and planning departments, and there's no longer, FES no longer holds any certificated positions. I know we talked earlier about the management piece. That's not related. I'm just wondering if that's related to this. That's my first question. My second question is, what does it mean that we don't have certificated positions at FES anymore?
Chair Herdman to Trustee Herdlicka. So what's great about being in facilities and environmental services is that we're surrounded by certificated staff. So the fact that we have 3 less within FES will not in any way, shape, or form reduce the amount of great advice that I get on a constant basis from certificated staff. So there will be lots of opportunities for that to continue to happen. What you're seeing here is, yes, partially it's reduction in management. We also are seeing a return, if you want, of the Facilities and Environmental Service Unit to its core business of taking care of bricks and mortar, making sure it's clean and safe for students and their learning, versus the development of sustainability criteria. Certainly had a nice connection with the environmental and integration services component that was within facilities and environments. And what has been developed will not be lost and will continue to be perpetuated in the sense that, again, what's been developed can continue to be shared with other schools, but it won't be, we will no longer have a certificated individual who can personalize that for each school.
Trustee Davis.
So as we relate this budget back to our 3-year education plan, there's a few areas that we've identified as a board as priorities. Math obviously was one of them, but also was literacy as well as Indigenous learning. And so I'm wondering, as we look at this budget, how this new budget addresses those priorities that the board has identified.
Chair Herdman to Trustee Davis. Within the Learning Service Unit, the staffing that we have been able to allocate to the literacy strategy and to the Indigenous education strategy has not changed. So given that we were making cuts across the service unit, the fact that we were able to maintain those at their current levels was a win.
On page 7-18, we have a nice big chart with lots of numbers. Under external services, we're seeing an increase, and I know that as we're winding down Chinook, I would have expected a decrease. Can you just explain why there's an increase there?
Chair Herdman, so there's a couple of factors of which I'm aware, and maybe my folks have a couple others. So one example is based on the conversation we had with Alberta Education, we have allocated more of the cost of the building to the floors that we're subleasing. So that's one example. Number 2 is while we had included the administrative costs of global learning within the external block, the portion of global learning that was related to students learning and the RAM allocations was rolled up in the instruction block. So based on the new guidance and the conversation we've had with Alberta Education, we've moved that entirely over to the external block. So those are the 2 biggest contributing factors that I'm aware of that would indicate why it's gone up, notwithstanding the fact that Chinook, we might see a bit of a reduction in the number of external block activities in that facility.
Well, the difference in accounting for global learning would definitely make that difference. Thank you. Also on that page, we see $9 million in professional services and board and system administration. Can you give some examples of what would be included here and why this is a increase from last year?
Chair Herdman, yes, I can. So included in that 9 million would be things such as 3.2 million for the Education Center and Saffron Center operating costs, approximately $3 million remaining in our TELUS contract for payroll services. There's about $800,000 for legal fees, $500,000 annual accrual related to the board election process. There's about $200,000 related to our annual audit fee, and approximately $100,000 for employee engagement.
I knew you had an answer. Throughout the document, we refer to the reclassification of the infrastructure maintenance and renewal funding. So is that why our board-funded amortization went up so much from last year, or do those things not have anything to do with each other?
Chair Herdman, so they don't have anything to do with each other. Infrastructure maintenance and renewal is treated separately from board-funded non-facility capital. There was a significant amount of board-funded non-facility capital activity. For example, the replacement of the student information system, the implementation of our Hyperion budgeting system, a component of the wireless program that we roll out across the system. So all of those things are driving up amortization related to board-funded non-facility capital.
So then what is the impact, if any, on the reclassification of the IMR funding?
So Chair Herdman, the change to IMR, infrastructure maintenance and renewal, is that the government has mandated a minimum component of their funding needs to be in the nature of capital. So it gets a little complicated, but if they give us $35 million, let's say, and 30% of that, so let's call it $9 million for round numbers, would be capital. It's not recognized as revenue in the year that it's received. So the revenue that we'd recognize would be 35 less 9. We would do the work. That capital work might be let's say it's a roof that extends the life of the asset by 10 years. So we would then bring in that other $9 million of revenue over the 10 years, as we would also have increased amortization related to that renewed roof over that 10-year period. So that's the impact. We would see a reduction in our overall IMR revenue, all things being equal. Having said that, we will then have some amortization from the year before that would come in, and the year before and the year before. So that's the changes we'll see throughout the document as a result of that government change around how IMR is to be spent.
Trustees, any further questions? Trustee Davis?
On page 7-34, when we look at those staff resource projections, when we look at the psychologists, braille assistants, deaf and hard of hearing specialists, mental health specialists, OT and speech, have we broken that out? I know it's wrapped up in other numbers, but how many of those specialists do we have? And has there been a change in this year over last year? If you need to come back to it at the next meeting, that would be fine too. It just occurred to me as I was looking at that.
Chair Herdman to Trustee Davis. So the part we can answer quite quickly is that there is no overall change, but in terms of a breakdown for every role, we don't have that available right now.
So on page 7-24 and on the same chart is repeated at other places. Under budget add requests, so we have a budget add request for 8.6 million in certificated permanent salaries and benefits. I'm just wondering why this column is on the left side of the status quo column rather than on the right side. So were these things that we're doing this year that we're continuing, or are these new things? What are they?
Chair Herdman, so in anticipating some questions on this slide, it occurred to us that perhaps our attempt at clarity was not quite as clear as we would have hoped. It made a great deal of sense to us at the time, but then with fresh eyes, what I would suggest is you would need to look at the column headed budget add requests, along with service unit reductions together to understand. So it may be a little bit impolite to say, but the $8.6 million ad was essentially a sum of all of the requests that were received, and we put it in a certain line, which you see there as certificated. The numbers in the service unit reductions column would then allocate that out to where the actual net of the adds and the reductions would end up. So said another way, if you start in the fall budget update 17-18 on the left-hand side of the page, all of the puts and takes in all those columns get you to the right place for budgets 18-19, but the allocation in some of those columns is not necessarily accurate. It's kind of the sausage making. So my recommendation would be look at the budget add requests and the service unit reduction columns together, and that gives you a good sense of what's going on in each of the service units in total.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. Trustees, any further questions? Sorry, Trustee Hrdlicka, you had your hand up before. Did you have a question?
There we go. Okay. So 7-31. And when we're talking about our reserves, so I see that we have planned use for 2.5 million. Can you remind me, you talked about this a little bit earlier around the full-day kindergarten. That's not included in here, is that correct? Or
Chair Herdman, through to Trustee Hrdlicka, yes, the board decision to allocate up to $1.2 million of reserve to support the maintenance of all-day kindergarten at 16 sites is not included in that 2.5 drawdown of reserves.
so I guess it's a question, it's around our reserve levels. If you look at the graph underneath there, it really shows that the CBE does have very low reserves, certainly compared to other school boards in the province. And I guess because we are the largest school board, my question would just be, what does it mean to have such low reserves? What does it mean for an organization like the CBE to have reserves at that level? I guess I'm looking for the benefits and kind of our challenges.
Chair Herdman, through to Trustee Hrdlicka, the cheeky part of me would say it's like walking along a high wire and the mat is smaller. Having said that, what I would say is low levels of reserves. The positive would be that we as an organization are ensuring that the revenue we receive in the year for the benefit of the students in the system in the year is being used for those systems. So we're not putting it away for future purposes, some of which we may not know. The downside is that if there is any unanticipated, reasonably significant occurrences, so in the past we've seen things like the Government of Canada increasing its acceptance of immigrants into the country, and those flowing to Alberta and some of those flowing to Calgary and then on to the CBE, our ability to respond fully and completely to those kinds of events is limited. We still have, as this projection shows, about $12.3 million of reserves available to us. So it's modest, but it's certainly not nothing. And we can also anticipate, I think, as we go through this budget year, that there will be some evolving differences in how we actually spend money against the plan that may end up seeing that increase a little bit. Don't know that, but I guess history would suggest that's the most likely outcome. So yeah, it's not where we'd necessarily like it to be in terms of we're fully confident that we can address every issue that comes our way, but it's at a level, I think, where we can at least accept one bump along the way. If we get 3 or 4, it'll be a bit more of a challenge.
So on page 7-71, we have a breakdown of schools and areas expenses. And I just noticed that the line item for other supplies shows a 15% increase. So I'm just wondering, is that at the schools level? Is that something else? What is accounting for that increase in other supplies?
Chair Herdman, so I would draw your attention to the line 2 down, which is textbooks and materials. So there's been a reallocation between textbooks and materials and other supplies year over year. We did that for a couple of reasons. One was based on the additional guidance that came our way related to Bill 1, an act to reduce school fees, and the desire of government to reduce or eliminate, in this case, eliminate the instructional supplies and materials fee, and also our monitoring of actual school spending. We believe that the allocation we have for 18-19 better reflects what will actually happen out in the system. And schools and areas is activity out in schools and areas. There is no central component within that.
Thank you. Trustee Davis?
Just a question on 7-96 and 97, where we look at the City of Calgary's budgets. And we don't, I see that there's going to be an increase in the educational assessment. And I know that a few years ago there was education tax room, which the province gave back to the city, but which the city, I think, rightfully took. And I'm just wondering, was that, I think that was a couple of years ago, has that happened since? And when will we have any projections on, or when will the city have those projections? Do we know?
Chair Herdman, through to Trustee Davis. Interesting question, largely outside of our wheelhouse. Having said that, when the city does its budgeting, it makes an estimate of what it believes the provincial government will request from the city for the purposes of education. If the provincial request is less than what the city budgeted, the city then has education room. In no event does that flow back to public school jurisdictions, either us or the Catholics in the City of Calgary. So it's largely beyond our control. I believe the city would just say it's one of those little budget variances. They make an estimate, the province comes in later and says this is what it is, and there we go. So yeah, it's an interesting situation. Certainly attracts lots of media attention, however.
Yeah, I always loved how they called it tax room rather than the education portion of the property tax. We talked a little bit around the fee replacement grant or Bill 1 funding before, and how it's based on 2015-16 student numbers and fees at that time. Calgary transit fees, I believe, went up from $65 to $70, and then next year they're supposed to go up to $75. So that's a 7% increase from last year to this year, and then this year to next year. So has the province taken this into account, or are they expecting us to absorb the increase for these rebates that we will have to pay?
Chair Herdman, so for under Bill 1, if you are eligible for transport based on where you live and the distance from your school and whatnot, you are either eligible for fee transportation on your yellow bus or for fully rebated transport, well, for rebated transport on Calgary Transit.
The understanding we have with Alberta Education and under the Act is that we're on the hook for the amount of, the rebate would be the amount of funding we receive from Alberta Education, which is currently $549 per student. Therefore, if there is an increase in the transit fee, that will land on the fee-paying student and or family. We would provide the maximum rebate that we're funded for, the $549, and that increase would be on the rider.
So parent fees for eligible high school students are going up next year due to Calgary Transit increased prices.
Chair Herdman, all things being equal and no new announcements, yes, the fee for eligible riders on Calgary Transit will go up. I believe the Act and regulation for transportation allow for increases beyond 5% without ministerial approval if it's sourced to the city's transportation, the city's transportation department.
It's a nice way that they can get around the 5% rule. Trustees, any further questions? Trustee Hrdlicka?
On that same page, I think, page, maybe not, 7-75. When we're talking about Chinook learning, I just had a question. It's near the kind of bottomish of the page. In 2018-19, Chinook learning staff will support students in adult English language learning. Can you just clarify what that is?
Chair Herdman to Trustee Hrdlicka. The adult English language learning are grant programs that we have offered through a grant by the federal government and a grant by the provincial government. These are grants that are offered to many of our newest Calgarians, many of whom are parents in our system. In addition, we have used that opportunity to support some of our employees in developing their English language skills.
Thanks for that. There was I think it's on the same page, and non-credited continuing ed, professional development, corporate training, that's for staff too?
Chair Herdman to Trustee Hrdlicka. It is for staff. It is also for people who might want to become staff with the Calgary Board of Education. So that is open to people who might want to brush up their skills. So for example, if we had someone who had been a secretary who took a break to perhaps raise a family and need to come back and update in accounting packages or those sorts of things, that is often used by our staff and those wanting to be CBE staff, but it is open to the public. It could be others.
Trustee Hrdlicka?
So I'm wondering how the review by the province had an impact or impacts any changes in our budget.
Chair Herdman through to Trustee Hrdlicka. So as we discussed, the operational review did have some impact in terms of where lease costs were allocated. That of course did not have any impact on dollars available to go to schools, just a difference in presentation. To my knowledge, there was no other recommendations or observations in the operational review report that influenced this budget. I think we continue to have some pretty clean processes around what we spend money on and why, and there was no observations to the contrary in the report that I'm aware of.
Trustee Davis?
Just a question on the IMR funding. Have we finalized, or do we know what IMR funding we're expecting for this budget year? And how does it compare to what we received last year?
Chair Herdman through to Trustee Davis. So yes, we do know. I don't have it at my fingertips, but I believe it's in the $34 million range, and I think it's down a couple $1 million from the prior year, which is around 36. Chair Herdman through to Trustee Davis, I would say that's generally the level of variability that we see, a couple $1 million plus or minus. As Superintendent Breton said, over a longer period of time, we've seen much bigger swings, but of late, sort of around the $34 to $36 million range is where we've been.
Trustee Hrdlicka?
So on page 7-72, and it's the second item in that chart there, and it's around sick relief. And I guess I just want to be clear what we're talking about there. Is it just sick relief? It's all of those things? Is that correct?
Chair Herdman through to Trustee Hrdlicka, yes. So in that line item that you're referencing, sick relief, on-demand IT support, leaves, donation-funded expenses, and ATRF, which would be the Alberta Teachers Retirement Fund. Sick relief is only one component of that. In doing a little bit of looking, sick relief is sort of maintaining it at or around $4 million a year, so there's been no material change there. The biggest contributing factor to the change would be donation-funded expenses. So that is fundraising activity that occurs out in our schools. That sort of line item is inherently variable depending on what schools are planning, when, those kinds of things. So that, I think, speaks to the majority of that change.
Trustee Hrdlicka?
So on that same page, I guess it's the fourth item, it's around special education contracted services. What kind of services are there? And we're seeing a decrease in that. Can you share what that's from?
Chair Herdman to Trustee Hrdlicka. So we did have 2 centrally supported behavior support worker positions that we have reallocated to schools to support 2 new programs for students with mental health and behavior issues.
Trustee Hrdlicka?
So we had these were central positions that are now back in the schools. How will that impact our system, our bigger system, not having those the centralized staff there?
Chair Herdman to Trustee Hrdlicka. Those 2 individuals, I would say, work through our area offices to support unique cases. Certainly, we do have resources in terms of the specialists that are available and psychology support to assist in inclusive practices in our schools. So we would hope that those needs can be met elsewhere.
Kind of a detailed question around transportation on page 7-64. When you break it down, the other supplies and services line, it says that it will be about 1.2 million next year, and I was just looking on last year's budget and it was less than that, so I'm just wondering what's the difference this year?
Chair Herdman, so there's been a little bit, once again, of some readjustment based on actual experience. So if we were to do an apples to apples comparison between the 18-19 number of 1.173, that prior year number would probably be closer to $536,000, leaving a difference of, it would have been $636,000. The difference then being primarily the outsourced admin fees for the rebate program, $536,000.
But didn't we have those costs this year?
We were sort of in the process of it, so that we will have the full year costs next year, or in 18-19. Yeah, so there's a little bit of that. It wasn't necessarily budgeted because it was, we knew we had to provide rebates. The how was under development, so we've just carried that against the program.
Trustees, any further questions? Trustee Hrdlicka?
7-55. I'm just wondering what the impacts of stable funding the last 3 years, I would say, rates are and funding enrollment on our system.
Chair Herdman through to Trustee Hrdlicka. So stable rates are good in that they're predictable and they're stable. The downside is we are an organization that continually experiences cost pressures. I think we've talked about that previously, things like operating costs of new schools, grid movement of our staff, other inflationary pressures for things like system contracts, those purchases of goods and services. So with stable rates, if you were to sort of conceive of an example where we held the number of students constant year over year, and you have a stable rate, I think it becomes obvious that any cost increases are difficult to accommodate with stable rates. So then we get ourselves to enrollment growth. So providing funding for each student in our system is very helpful. What I would say is roughly 65 to 70% of the dollars we receive for each additional student goes to support the cost of that student in our system. So that's the RAM allocation, that's the additional space that may be required, all of the bits and pieces that provide that learning environment for the student, leaving the remainder, let's say 30% of the enrollment growth funding, to address all of those other costs that are not strictly addressed through stable, predictable funding. So that's back to the cost of operating our new schools, the inflationary impacts, the grid movement. What we're finding is that enrollment growth contribution does not cover off the gap that we're seeing to maintain services and programs at the prior year level, which gets us to the scenario where we're looking at places to reduce, to be more efficient, to be more effective, to make it all fit. So stable and predictable is good, and we do appreciate government's commitment through these tough economic times to public education. We also appreciate enrollment growth, but it would certainly be nice to see some increase in the basic rates over time to address all of those various inflationary pressures.
And just to follow up on that, I know that we had, maybe Chair Herdman, you can remind me, or Superintendent Grundy, the page that has the graph.
7-26.
Thank you. So 7-26, by looking at that, if we go back a couple years, we'll see in 2011, 2012, in that year, as a system, we were getting a significant larger number. And we saw a decrease, I think in 2013, 14. Or 2000, around there, and that's heavily impacted us. Can you speak to that? The fact that we were, getting a certain amount of money, and then all of a sudden, in 1 year, we had a huge drop, and how that's impacted the system, that cumulative effect, I guess, is where I was going.
Chair Herdman through to Trustee Hrdlicka. So yes, I think if you go down or back in time to 2011-12, you would find that the funding per student would be significantly above what the current year levels are. Then over a couple of years, we saw that, and I think it's now up on the screen, we saw that amount come down and then back up to the level where we're at currently. I would say other contributing factors would be that through much of that time period from 11 to 12, we weren't seeing a great deal of new school construction activity, which means we were putting our students in existing facilities, but as we continued to grow, we weren't incurring sort of those operating costs of new schools.
So that was very helpful. Over the last little while, we've been seeing, the reduction and then stabilization of the per student and a lot of building activity. So we've got some cost pressures at the same time, as I mentioned previously, stable funding levels. So that creates pressure in a system where we're seeing that those inflationary impacts in a number of areas over time.
Just to clarify, that last bullet point does not include the SIF funding, correct?
Chair Herdman, that is correct. It does not have the SIF funding. I would anticipate it'll come close to that $9,083 amount for the prior year once we include that.
Trustees, any further questions on the budget?
Chair Herdman, to trustees, just a reminder that the SIF funding that has just been announced is for 1 year only.
Yes. Okay, so this item will be on next week's agenda for debate, and if trustees have any further questions that they wish to ask next week before we debate, that will definitely be allowed. And we will consider this item at the May 22nd, 2018 agenda. So that brings us to the consent agenda of our meeting. With the exception of the locally developed courses, all items will be deemed to be approved with the agenda. And the board has one land, one labor, and one legal matter to deal with in camera following the public portion of this meeting. So this brings us to the conclusion of the public portion. I'd like to thank all of you who joined us, and our next meeting is scheduled for next Tuesday, May 22nd. Thanks.